Welcome to DelphiCon 2021. My name is Cary Jensen. I'm going to be leading this FireDAC panel where we're going to discuss both the power and speed of this cross-platform database access mechanism in Delphi and answer your questions as well. And joining me today are Jens Fudge of Archersoft App and Olaf Monien from Developer Experts LLC. And gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to this broadcast. We're going to start off by introducing ourselves so that you have some sense of our background, and then we will be taking your questions. So if you have questions, please enter it into the appropriate place in the application, and we'll get to them as we will go through them and do our very best to answer those questions. If we run out of questions momentarily, we may introduce some feature or discuss a feature of FireDAC that we particularly like, and where appropriate, I will pop my screen over to Delphi and we'll look at some examples. I've got quite a few code examples. So let's get underway. Okay, so my name is Cary Jensen. I've been a professional developer for 34 years. During that time, I have not only been a developer, and that's my primary role is writing code, but I've also been a consultant, trainer, and mentor. In fact, I was the author of and the primary trainer for the 1995 Delphi World Tour, in which we introduced the product Delphi to the world. I've been the author of more than 25 books on software. My latest book is Delphi in Depth, and I'll say Delphi sometimes, and sometimes I'll say Delphi, so excuse me, but I understand we have two different ways of pronouncing that. My particular interest has been in database development, application architecture, and component development. I'm an Embarco MVP and a Spirit of Delphi recipient. And recently I was appointed as an adjunct professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Group in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Rice University. That's the same place where I received my PhD in 1988. Okay, next, Jens, let's talk about you.
Sure. My name is Jens Fudge, and I've been working with Delphi since it came out in 1995. And in fact, the very first time I saw Delphi in action was on the 1995 Delphi World Tour, where Cary Jensen was in Denmark, and I attended that session, and I have loved Delphi ever since. Primarily, I work as a consultant for different companies here in Denmark, where I live, but I also work as a trainer for Delphi companies, probably most in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And I really enjoy going to different conferences, like the Econ conference that just been in Germany a couple of weeks ago. And next week, or last week it was, and next week I'm going to a conference here in Denmark that we're having also. I've been an Embarcadero MVP since 2012, since the program was first established. And I'm a board member of the Danish Delphi Users Group, and in fact, I have recently become the chairman of said group.
Outstanding. Well, welcome. We look forward to discussing FireDAC with you. So next, Olaf.
Yeah, thanks, Cary. My name is Olaf Monien, and I'm working for Developer Experts, a US-based company, and Unternehmensberatung Monien, which is basically the German branch of that same thing. And what we do is, consulting in the area of software development, mostly Delphi, of course. And many of you have seen me having talks on REST services, on multi-threading, on databases like this one here, and some kind of internet applications, so, and mobile devices, of course. So that's the areas that I frequently work with and have certainly some experience with. And I'm a Delphi user, and I pronounce Delphi, or try to pronounce it as Delphi. Sometimes, though, like Cary, I'm switching over to Delphi when I'm switching from German to English. So same thing here. But usually I try to use the Delphi version, and I'm using it from day one too. Since it came out, and I remember having seen Cary on one of the very first public presentations, and I got fascinated, and now I'm sitting here as a Embarcadero MVP, and I am actually the coordinator for the German-speaking region. DACH means German-speaking, and I actually used Builtin products even before Delphi, so I'm still used to a little bit writing code in Turbo Pascal, and yeah, that's my background.
Well, thank you very much, Olaf. We're very pleased to have you here. And just I'll add one comment too, that I imagine, Jens, where did you come from? Did you come from the Turbo Pascal side or the FireDAC side to Delphi?
Actually, Delphi is more or less the first programming language that I've been using. At school, I had some Turbo Pascal, but I didn't program before Delphi, actually.
Okay, interesting. When I was in school, which was a long time ago, the first programming language I learned was Pascal, but it wasn't with Turbo Pascal. But when I started my business back in 1988, my wife and I should say, started our business in 1988, I fell into the database world, and I was a Paradox developer. And in fact, I had a column in Paradox Informant magazine for quite a long time. I wrote 12 books about Paradox development. So I came from that side. So it's kind of good that we got a nice mix here.
The side I actually came from was molecular biology, which was what I studied at university.
Okay.
I'm actually somewhere in between. I came from, as my very first real computer, from an Apple II. So which is quite interesting now that we can actually compile for apples again, or actually the first time that we can compile for apples was on Delphi XE. And the first computer was an Apple, and then I used BASIC, which was quite an experience. And later on, I got to Turbo Pascal and just wrote code, just simple stuff. And then I discovered Paradox, and I only got interested into the database features, and then Delphi 1 came out. So we were somehow able to program databases with Delphi, and I used Paradox as the very first database for me. So it's quite interesting to see who everybody came to Delphi and his database features.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point to bring everything back around to FireDAC. The original database access in Delphi was the Builtin database engine, which in the previous versions of Paradox for Windows had the name ODAPI, the Open Database Access Programming Interface, and then it became IDAPI, the Independent Database Application Programming Interface, and then it became IDAPI, but the Integrated Database Application Programming Interface. And actually, the first Windows program that used the ODAPI, IDAPI line was this very strange product that Philippe Kahn promoted called Object Vision. And I just turned around and looked up at my bookcase, and on the top I've got a shrink-wrapped copy of Object Vision, never been opened. Also got a shrink-wrapped copy of the first version of Delphi. We often refer to it as Delphi 1, but in fact it was just called Delphi. The second version was called Delphi 2. Okay, so let's open the floor to questions. Olaf, you are the kind of moderator here. Do we have any questions about FireDAC?
Well, some people are saying hello and so forth, and trying to explain how they pronounce Delphi. But there is actually one question from Ken. He asked, could we compare Unideck and FireDAC? Well, let me take that. FireDAC is what's in the box with Delphi, and it's a database framework for accessing multiple different database management systems. So you can access anything from SQLite over Access, Microsoft Access, to Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, IBM, Teradata, whatever. So, and then there are third parties. There is one third party, DevArt, and they have a product called Unideck, which is just it is the same kind of product. It's a database access library for different database systems. So they are competitors in some way. The one you have to pay extra for, and the other one is in the box. Depending on the edition of Delphi, you get different features, of course, and they have a similar feature set. So I don't think we will go into comparing them side by side or something. So if you have a Delphi version that comes without FireDAC, then of course it might be an option to go to Unideck. Or if you have any feature request that FireDAC can't fill in, then and if DevArt has that feature, well, it's your turn to go there. Both frameworks are fast, they are stable from what I hear, even from the Unideck side, and they have a lot of similarities. Some features are differently, but in general, they are covering the same functionality.
Jens, have you had any experience with Unideck?
Yes, I have actually. As I'm working as a consultant for different customers, one of my customers actually use Unideck, and I have to say it is, as Olaf said, it's a competitor for FireDAC. It's in some respects it's better, in some respects it's missing some features, but it is a real competitor for FireDAC. So I would agree with Olaf that if you have something that you really can't do with FireDAC, then Unideck would be a place to go and have a look and see if there's something there.
I will. I just have to admit that the DevArt has been a supporter of the Delphi Developer Days program that I have that my wife and I started in 2001 and ended in 2017. It's not ended. I have to tell you, we are hoping to do a farewell tour of Delphi Developer Days, so we'll have to see whether that's possible or not. But I will say that I believe I have not ever used the product. However, there is one thing that I believe is true that has a lot of interest. I really would like to see FireDAC add this capability, but I believe with Unideck, there are several databases that you can access directly without a intermediate DLL. I think, for instance, it's Oracle, and then there's at least one more, and that's very similar to a Java class 4 driver, which talks to the API of the database directly, and that's a really attractive capability. Because if you're relying on a DLL, there's some platforms where you are not going to be able to touch the database because it's DLLs are Windows executables. So that's an interesting thing. Great. Well, next question.
I have another question here, or it's actually a more or less a statement or feature request, whatever. Unfortunately, I can't see the name who asked the question. It's just 2 dashes here in that window. And the person says, evidently, Embarcadero has no plans to use Microsoft's new OnlyDB driver with FireDAC or SQL Server on SQL Server, choosing to stay with lower ODBC, is there any way I can force FireDAC to use this new SQL Server standard driver manually? I believe when you connect to Microsoft SQL Server, you are actually going through a highly optimized way through ODBC. It's not that slow, old-fashioned ODBC interface that you're using. ODBC is available as a separate driver for FireDAC, and some parts of some drivers are actually going through that. But my belief is that, especially for Microsoft SQL Server, it's using an optimized way, and it's certainly fast, and it's actually even faster than the ADO components, which are a thin wrapper around Microsoft's OnlyDB, the old OnlyDB implementation, which is, by the way, deprecated. So I will look into the RSP that the person mentioned here and see what the exact RSP is saying. But for now, I would say even if not the newest driver is used, it's using the driver engine provided by Microsoft, updated frequently, and it's fast. So if you have concerns about speed or performance, let me know what exact concerns you have.
Excellent, excellent. By the way, we are going to make this slide deck, which only has 5 slides, but we're going to make that available for download. I don't know what that mechanism looks like, but it does have all our contact information on there. So if any of you out there want to contact one of us directly, you will have both our email address and our LinkedIn information, our Twitter information, and so forth. Okay.
I see a question here about the connection. And the question is from Yarong. And hi, about the FireDAC connection, what's the best practice to use? One for each query, one for each data module, or one for the application? And I would say that in my experience, it really depends on the situation that you're in. I think it might be a little overkill to have one for each query, but if you're running something threaded, then you're definitely going to have a new connection for each thread that you're running, because the database won't be able to do it properly if you do not. So the database has to be able to see each thread as a separate user. But apart from that, I think that I normally have a connection probably for the application, but unless I'm doing the threaded model. But sometimes I'll do an extra connection if I have something specific that I'm encapsulating into something, so that I don't have to have dependencies all over the place.
Excellent. Yeah, that's an excellent answer to that question. Unless you're using pooled connections, you definitely don't want to create multiple connections unless there is a reason why. And of course, as Jens mentioned, having a thread that is touching the database, it needs to be seen as a separate user so that the competition for record locks is the same that the database implements for just about everything, which is specifically if 2 users try to edit the same record and post to the same record, one will win and one will lose, and that's the way it should work with your threads. Unless you're using pooled connections, there's a lot of overhead associated with creating and dropping a connection. So that's why we don't use multiple ones. And then if everything is running in the main thread of the application, there's absolutely no reason in the world to have multiple connections. It just doesn't do you any good. I would also mention that there is a component within FireDAC called the FD Event Alerter, and it listens for notifications from the database or events from the database, and it actually creates its own connection. You have to hook it up to a connection, but basically what it does is it reads all the parameters of that connection. It creates its own connection because it's running in a background thread or a worker thread.
And the alerter structure or implementation is specific per database. It even works for Sqlite, but there obviously it can only work in process because there is no database server process. It's just your own process accessing of that file. So even there you can use the alerter. And depending on the database, it's quite obvious that it needs to go through a single or a separate connection because it's talking. If you use it on Microsoft SQL Server, it's using Microsoft's broker service, which is something, well, somewhere in the database server, which is completely different from standard query query execution. So it's going through. Even for that purpose, it's using its own connection here. And we are talking a lot about Microsoft SQL Server here, probably because it's quite frequently used in projects. But I have a question here about DBase files. So there is Peter using DBase in a GIS system where he says it's the standard database and he still has to use DBase. So what is the best driver engine to use DBase from within Delphi? You can actually use it from FireDAC, but I'm not sure if that is the best way. Jens or Cary, do you have any experience still with DBase?
Well,
sorry.
I actually have some information about that, but what you do is you use an ODBC driver. So in my book, Delphi In-Depth FireDAC, the second chapter is about connections, and it's a very important chapter because until the chapter 1 is just kind of overall introduction to FireDAC, but chapter 2 is talking about connections. And given that there is a history, both through the Paradox, then into the Delphi products, a history of using databases like Paradox and DBase, there needs to be some way to touch and work with these original local file server based databases. And the way to do that is through ODBC. And so you can use the ODBC driver and configure it, either configure it as a definition on each machine, or you can do it dynamically within your application. In fact, I have an example in the book where it looks out and looks to see if there's an ODBC definition for Paradox. So you'd have to modify it a little bit to use DBase. And if it doesn't see it there, it actually creates one on the local machine, a definition that it can then hook up to. So there's two ways of doing it dynamically or actually accessing a ODBC definition on the local machine if it already exists. But that's how you can work with files like DBase and Access and Paradox.
Okay. Yeah, it's pretty much ODBC. I'm sure there are still specialized drivers for DBase in Delphi, but it's been quite a while since I used DBase the last time. So yes, my recommendation would be just FireDAC and ODBC. There is another question around SQL Server. There is Sandro asking, is there any tip to turn FireDAC faster than ADO or DBGO, as we officially say, when using SQL Server? My experience is I had a pretty large project where we were using ADO to access Microsoft SQL Server, and that was several years ago. And since then, there was no development anymore on ADO side. And back then, when we switched to FireDAC, we immediately measured performance increases. So it was just better performance by just switching from ADO to FireDAC. We didn't optimize anything on the FireDAC side, and it was several years ago, meaning several versions of FireDAC ago. So I would just say, just switch and try. It should be faster already, especially if you're asking for large amounts of data, which seems to be much better handled in FireDAC than in the ADO drivers. And the actual drivers behind FireDAC, if you use the newest Microsoft ones, those drivers are actively developed by Microsoft. The older OnlyDB drivers that you use for ADO are deprecated, and Microsoft really doesn't do any development anymore on these.
Interesting. Okay, I actually looked up in my book about the ODBC, and basically you can either dynamically configure ODBC or you can define a data source. And one of my project examples looks to see if a ODBC data source is already defined. If not, it creates it and then it uses it. And the next time it just sees it as there and it uses it.
Okay, good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Okay, so here comes another question. Again, from a user where I can't see the name. I would like to see strategies how to manage large databases on PCs, because many users had to install a server, and this can go badly in many circumstances. So I would like to see strategies with serverless databases like Sqlite. Yeah, I mean, it's basically one of the possible questions. If you want to have a single user desktop database without a server process running on the same machine, well, go for Sqlite. I am using that in a couple of projects, and it's very successful. It can handle up to, I believe, 150 or 70 excuse me, it can handle up to 150 or 170 gigabyte of database sizes, so it can handle large databases. So any more suggestions for well, single user flat file databases to use?
Well, since the question involved large databases, your suggestion is very, very good. And I will just say that there are some alternatives if you're talking about small databases. For instance, let's say that as a Christmas present, maybe you want to share with your friends and family a little address book, or something where they can put in contacts and phone numbers and email addresses and so forth. You can simply use a local file, but these are not large databases. And in that case, you may use the FDMem table, and because it can save to a file and it can read from a file. You can use a client data set. You could also use JSON. The problem with those, of course, is that you don't have any type of transactions and there's no rollback. If something goes wrong, the simple little database can become corrupt. But you can have relations, so you can have master detail type relationships within both client data set and FDMem table, and then certainly with JSON you can have hierarchical structures. But there again, you lose the integrity, and you could potentially have corruption, and then also there's no security there either. because someone could just take Notepad and open up the file and look at all your data. So SQLite is a very good answer to that particular issue, so that especially if you have a larger amount of data, because you don't want to have to read a very large file into memory. You'll run out of memory or eventually.
Yeah, exactly. And SQLite is a full SQL database, even though it's just a flat file and everything, well, is handled inside your own process. And I believe I said gigabytes. It's actually terabytes. So I just looked up the actual limit. So the limit is at about 140 terabyte, not gigabytes. So that should be large for most purposes.
That should
large
handle
enough.
that should handle most people's address books, don't you think?
Probably.
Yeah, depends on the company. But I mean,
well, for a personal address book, it will work.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me see. What do we have?
There's been a couple of questions stating that on Android, on an Android device, you cannot access a remote database with FireDAC, but you can on Unideck. And I just want to put a small comment on that I actually would not at all have a database exposed so that you can talk to it from an Android device. I would probably make a REST server instead, so I wouldn't really need to have a direct connection to any database from a mobile device.
You know, there's another angle to this also. You can also create databases in the cloud, Amazon S3. There's a variety, but you are exposed though. You're out there in the wild, and hackers could potentially get into your data, but that is another solution. You also, if you lose your internet connection, you can't touch your database. But there's a number of different options from Google Cloud and Amazon cloud services that you can access the data from almost anything, given the exposure, if you're willing to accept that.
And with a mobile device, if you're moving your mobile device around, which probably makes sense since it's a mobile device, you'll go to different cells all the time and you'll lose your connection once in a while, and you're going to have to handle that.
And I should point out that if you have Delphi Enterprise or higher, that CData provides you with certain drivers for free download. And for instance, when I did some work with Amazon Cloud, I found that it was DynamoDB was one of them. Another one was a far more flexible, just object storage, and the driver was free. Now I found a problem with the DynamoDB driver, and I reported to CData, and they have fixed that. So can't remember exactly what it was, but there was you couldn't write to a field in trying to remember what it was. It was an S3 type database. It was an object store, and it is an object store that technically you could at any time do an insert query where you add a field that doesn't exist yet in a given record. And DynamoDB was actually looking at the metadata of the database, and if it didn't see that field already existed, it rejected the query. It didn't even try. But that's one of the characteristics of that particular database is you could create new fields on the fly, and so that look at two different records, and they have different fields in them. But they have fixed that now, and CData that's a pretty powerful option and it fits right in. The CData drivers are FireDAC drivers, so you just plug it in like any other. You install it, and then there it is, and you can select that CData data source for your database, and it allows you to touch. I think there's about 100 drivers that are available to enterprise and higher Delphi users.
I believe they are even close to 200 by now. It's amazing the number of drivers that they are creating on. I don't know. It's like they are bringing out a new driver every month or so. It's like crazy. Yeah, it's.
You're not just talking about databases. I mean, you could do Google Mail, and I mean, there's a lot of different sources that you can use for reading and writing data that aren't what we would consider traditional databases.
One great thing I saw about CData connectors was I was asked to make a demo on CData connectors, so I looked through what they had, and I found they had a really nifty little Google Calendar CData connector. And with that, you could log on to your Google Calendar and treat it like a database or a data set, and that was really, really good. So you could put inserts and deletes and updates and everything, and it was just like working with a data set, and we're used to working with data sets, so everything was just very, very smooth and very easy to work with.
Right. There is one question from Dimitris asking for specific versions that are supported by FireDAC. There is actually a link. I'm just inserting that to the question where it specifies every driver and how to connect, and usually the very first section in for every driver is where it says which versions are the latest ones. So I'm just posting that link, and just look it up and find out. So I'm posting that link in the question. Just see if you can find your database and which versions are supported. There is another question about multi-threading features. The question is, let's say I have a multi-threaded web server which uses FireDAC to return data. If I use an FD manager to pull connections, do I still need to use critical sections around database access to maintain thread safety? Simple answer, no. Because the connection that you get from the pooling through the manager is yours on that specific thread that you are working on. So in that regards, once you get a connection, it's yours. And once you release it, well, you give it back to the pool, and it can be taken by others. So once you follow the concept, use one connection per thread, you are safe to go.
That's the reason why you want to use one connection per thread.
Yeah, I mean, when I try to explain why, I sometimes try to figure it by the transactions. If you have two threads accessing the same connection, then both threads would go through the same transaction, which cannot be working. So you need one transaction per thread, per user, per executing statement. So if another thread injects a query into your other transaction, that will lead to a big mess. So that's one other angle how to understand one connection per thread. Somebody says Unidoc does not require libmysql to connect to MySQL. True. One of the features that Unidoc has, they implemented some protocols by themselves in code. So they compile in the whole protocol to talk to the database. They do that for Oracle and for Microsoft, to name the two most prominent databases here in that regard. FireDAC does that for Sqlite. So if you're connecting to Sqlite, you don't need a Sqlite library. So, well, it's the way it is. Yes, that's true. Does Unideck work with Advantage Database? I don't know. We are talking about FireDAC here. So
Yeah, yeah.
I have no idea if Unideck can, but FireDAC can. So
I have something to say about Advantage Database. I wrote 3 books about it, and I loved that database. And Sybase bought Extended Systems, and then SAP bought Sybase. And SAP is doing their very, very best to kill that database, and it is a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy.
yeah, that's true.
Because
I
it
heard
was
that.
extraordinarily fast. I mean, we had a database that had 150 million records, and our queries returned in milliseconds. It was just amazing. That database in particular grew by 100,000 records every week. And it's just a shame, but FireDAC does have an Advantage database driver. It's just that many people I know are actually migrating away from Advantage because Sybase is not supporting it. And I've had people complain to me that they say, I can't buy a license for the Advantage database server, and my database is based on it. And the people that other people I know who have companies who have based their database on Advantage, they actually had a contract that said that they will have in perpetuity the ability to buy additional licenses for Advantage, and they're in good shape. But some people are having a really hard time getting licenses for it. But FireDAC supports it, and in fact, FireDAC supports it better than SAP does in terms of releasing functional drivers for accessing Advantage.
Yeah, it's a shame when some feature, something that established over the years as a reliable system gets bought by somebody else, and then they decide to, well, drop it. That happened quite a few times with other products as well. So yeah, it's if you based your product on something that got deprecated in that way, it's always a mess to deal with.
Yeah.
I have another question that we touched basically a few minutes ago. Are there any built-in features on how to keep all users updated on changes in the database? Interbase has the change view, but if the user has MS SQL, what to use? Just to throw in what the change view is in Interbase, it's a feature that they actually got a patent on, where you can basically select a view, a standard view, and that view tells you where updates are made to tables. So it's a very easy and convenient way to well, see what tables, what tables got updates that your user interface doesn't know about yet. So what can you do when you're not using Interbase? And Cary, you talked about the alerter system. Maybe you want to take that one.
Yes, actually, I gave a full talk on this topic at Econ 25 a couple of weeks ago. The event alerter listens to events, or in some parlance, they refer to them as notifications. And these are usually generated by triggers, sometimes stored procedures, but triggers on tables in the database. And the FD event alerter, it's set up to listen for those notifications. And in fact, in a database that I worked with recently, the person designing the application said, "Look, I've got a read-only view of data, but it has to be current. It has to be current." And so what I did is I took an event alerter. They say the event alerter will spawn its own thread, but I never got that to work, and I don't know why. But what I did is I spawned a thread, and it created an event alerter and hooked it up to the database and listened for it could be one or more different notifications. And when it saw those notifications, it made it a call to synchronize, and updated the view of the table. Now, very importantly, that table had to be read-only, because if you update the view of a table and someone's in the midst of editing a record or inserting a record, they're going to lose their data, and that's almost never acceptable. So that's a way to do it. Is you set up, and you can do this without the FD event alerter, but the FD event alerter is a wrapper that does all the little necessary bits and pieces that are for doing an update or actually responding to the fact that a particular table or set of tables has changed, whether it's an update, an insert, or a deletion from that table. And so it makes things much simpler. In the previously, and this is interesting because it was going back to Advantage. It was an Advantage database, and it has events as well that would be set by a trigger. We would execute a query and a special statement in the query, and that query would be blocked until, in other words, the query wouldn't return until the event was received, until the event occurred. And at that point, the code could then proceed to do whatever needed to do, given the fact that a given event was generated. So you can do it with a query, and it's different for every database. I mean, I don't know any databases that don't support notifications, but what's important is that it doesn't matter where in the world the edit came from. It could be a Windows service that occasionally inserts records into a database. It could be another user on the other side of the world who just edited a record, but your code can sit there and listen and wait until the event is triggered and respond to that. And so it's really, that's my talk was writing responsive code with FD event alerter, and that's, you know, that's it's like I said, it's a wrapper. It does a whole bunch of things for you. That and it has an event handler that is on alert. You know, once the event is identified, the event handler executes, and you can do whatever is necessary from that.
Yeah, interesting.
And that was a great talk, by the way.
Yes, I mean it sounds great. There is Alf asking, or actually it's more like a quote, a user quote. He is talking about bad experience with Oracle 11G, and they were using it with DB Express. So they went the painful way going through DB Express, and no wonder there were tons of problems. He's talking about catastrophe and 64-bit variables being treated the wrong way, I guess. And they changed to FireDAC, and it just processes that took them 10 seconds with DB Express now were handled in fractions of milliseconds. So yeah, FireDAC compared to DB Express it's two worlds. It's not evolution. It's something completely out of the old DB Express. Well, DB Express it probably came with good intentions, but it never made its way. It certainly has a very interesting architecture, and I know there are still projects using it, and there are third parties producing drivers for it. So it's not bad by itself, but it ended up just, well, I don't know. It took the wrong connection somewhere. I don't know.
Well, at the very beginning of this panel discussion, I had made some comments about the BDE, and really Delphi originally had this navigational model based on the BDE and paradox and D-based tables. And when it was called Enterprise at the time, when they were investigating creating Kylix, which is the Linux version of Delphi, they needed to find something that was a replacement for the BDE because the BDE was very specifically Windows-based. And they came up with DB Express, which is a pass-through SQL system. And it had a totally different model from the BDE. And so people who really needed to take an existing application and migrate it to DB Express, they had to re-architect their application. A huge disadvantage. And it wasn't flexible in the same way. You couldn't just open up a table and start scrolling through it. You had to actually move the data into a client data set, and that's where your data lived until you posted it back to the underlying database. And it did a lot of generation. I personally knew one of the primary architects at DB Express, and he was a C guy. I mean, he just saw the world as a C application. And those limitations, or the disconnect from the BDE, wasn't a real concern to those guys. And the thing about FireDAC, though, is that it takes us back all the way around again to something very, very similar to the BDE. In fact, converting a BDE application to FireDAC is really a trivial matter. And I believe that there's actually tools. I've never used them, but there's tools out there that can perform most of that conversion for you. And you don't have to change your code, and you don't have to change your architecture. So another benefit of FireDAC.
Yeah.
I just saw a question here about transactions, and someone asked if you do not by code have a commit or a rollback, will it do an automatic commit? And yes, it will. If you insert something or update a record with a query, and you do not specify a transaction, it will wrap a transaction around that query, and then it'll do an automatic commit if possible.
That's the default property. I mean, in the connection is the default property. Yes. You can turn that off.
Yeah.
But it's the default.
Yeah.
Is there an automatic way to lock all queries executed on the database? Yes, it's the FireDAC Monitor. I'm just posting the link in the documentation how to use the FireDAC Monitor. It's a great tool. It basically sits in between the database and your connections, and it listens to all the commands that you are sending through the line, and it will log all the parameters and result sets and everything. And it's quite convenient to use. It has a couple of parameters to configure. So the FireDAC Monitor, I posted the link to the tool.
And now that you're mentioning the FireDAC Monitor, there's been quite a lot of questions about Unideck, and the FireDAC Monitor is very, very similar to DevArt's version of what they have. They call it the DB Monitor. It works in a very similar way.
Yeah. I have a complicated question here. Let me just read it. Let's start from a simple case, mine. I have to deploy an Atlas database of places. So it's something about locations in that database, which consists of millions of records while divided 4 countries. So millions of records and lots of records for every single country in the world, I guess. So I would like to use a very simple DB that is Sqlite, that is very fast with the right indexes, no problem of performance here. But the correct strategy to implement, if one may want to browse the list of cities, is obscure to me. How to do that? I load a certain number of places, then okay, this is basically more a question about how to execute SQL on a database. So even if you're using Sqlite, which has no database process, no server process, it's the full SQL language that you can use. So you would basically, even for a large database with millions of records, you can still say select everything from cities, their name is like, let's say, new, and it would list all the cities that start with the word new, such as New York. and you can always limit the number of records returned from a select statement. So in FireDAC, there is a standard feature that by default, all you get back are the very first 50 records. That's a parameter in the FireDAC query component. So even if you do a select everything from cities in your huge database, which would return 1 million records, and that would probably block your application for almost forever. In FireDAC, you will only see the very first records, and those will be returned in like under a couple of milliseconds, even in SQLite. So get comfortable with SQL statements. Use select everything from a table without a where clause with caution. So always have a good where clause to limit the actual records that you want, even if there is a parameter in the query that limits that you can set to 50 records or 200 or whatever fits your needs.
One nice thing about that feature too, and I think it's in the FD connection where it exists. It's one of the it may be the fetch options, and I think it's called row set size or
Yes.
row size. And the nice
Row
thing
size.
is that when you execute that query, it brings back 50 records. But if you go down to the 50th record and try to go next, it goes and gets the next 50. So to a user, it kind of seems like all the data is there, and you set the row size relative to whatever you're displaying, but it'll systematically get more records. And if you say end, in other words, fd query one.end or last, I think it is, yeah, last, it actually goes and fetches everything. So that it'll work, you know. And there's also parameters you can set or properties you can set that say, I don't want my query to return until it's fetched everything, or you can say just, you know, return as soon as you fetch the row set. So you can configure this. That's the beautiful thing about the FD connection, is that there is an enormous amount of control that you have as the developer to configure how everything functions. So it's really important. There's 4 different, actually 5 options. There's fetch options, there's resource options, there's transaction options, and each one of them has a whole cluster of properties to them. And it's really important to familiarize yourself with what those options control, because that's where you get it your way. You are able to tell FireDAC how you want things to work.
I just have a small comment on the row set size when you're fetching only around 50 records or something. Please note that the record count will only count the actual records that you actually have fetched.
Okay, good. Well, we're coming to the end of the hour here, and Jim McKeith told us that he's no longer with us, by the way. And in fact, he hasn't said a word at the beginning of this because he has a talk right now. And he said, we're allowed to go over. And for those of you who need to go over and see Jim's talk or one of the other talks at this particular scheduled time, thank you for coming to our FireDAC panel. We really appreciate the questions. They've been excellent. They've been excellent. And if there are still some questions we haven't answered, Jens, Olaf, do you want to continue for at least a little longer?
Well, I can stay here for another 10 minutes or so, but I have to go in about 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Same for me. I have about 10 minutes. So if we can find some of the some important questions, well, let's have a quick look about the list of questions. Let me see, what do we have? Would you recommend changing ODAC SDAC to FireDAC? So that user, it's Gasmoko, is basically asking about if we would recommend changing from Unideck to FireDAC. If you have a working product and if you have a license of Unideck, and if it works for you, then I don't see a real reason why you would change over to FireDAC. Especially, there's another question where some concerns were about what feature is in what edition of Delphi. So if you only have Delphi Professional, then you only have access to local databases through FireDAC. So if you have a license of Unideck, of course, then you can access all remote databases as well. So for remote databases, meaning somewhere else than localhost, you will need Delphi Enterprise. Only in Delphi Enterprise and Architect, of course, there is access to remote databases. So changing from Unideck to FireDAC probably is not a good recommendation if everything works for you. Only if you are missing a feature or whatever, cannot get it working in Unideck, maybe try FireDAC if it would work better for you.
I would even supplement that comment by saying that it's not necessarily a matter of one or the other. So if you have a working product that is using the DevOps stuff and you have a specific query on a specific form on your application that the DevOps queries do not support, then you can mix. So you can just have FireDAC and DevOps running in the same application without any problems at all.
Right. Looking for, this is Dino asking, an interesting question actually. Looking forward to moving from Unideck on Android to REST and JSON. Will this be spoken on the JSON webinar later today? Well, I don't know what the JSON webinar will talk about. It's not me doing that one. And I believe it's not either of you. So I believe if somebody is talking about JSON, they will show how to get data through HTTP or HTTPS as a REST service, and the transport is usually done through JSON. So on a mobile device, you don't, or you would not access a remote database through a traditional database driver. That simply doesn't work. Of course, yeah, there are a couple of drivers who say they can do that, but it's a very special driver. In that case, the standard way is mobile device, talk through a REST service, get JSON from that server, and well, convert the JSON back to data like the FireDAC memory table or whatever. So yes, I'm pretty sure that they will talk in that JSON webinar about scenarios like that. Let me see. Jens, do you see anything that?
Not really. I'm just answering the question that you just answered verbally. I'm just putting some text onto that.
Yeah, the FireDAC event alerter sounds ideal for an audit trail. It can probably be used from
triggers.
Cary, go on.
Triggers on the database are actually really, really good for audit trails because it's all happening on the server side. So I would write an after insert, an after update, and after delete trigger, and perform the insertion into the audit trail from there, so that your application doesn't have to deal with it. And any other applications that touch that database, whether they're written in Delphi or anything else, will also have that same audit trail.
I found another JSON-related question here from Ricardo. He's asking, are you planning to build a JSON to dataset to JSON converter to work with FireDAC components like FD query, FD table, FD mem table? Well, we are not planning that. Actually, we are not R&D of Embarcaderos, but there is already such a component.
Yes. Yeah.
It's already there. It's the dataset adapter. So the REST response dataset adapter works in both ways. So you can actually connect a REST client's response and request JSON value to a dataset adapter, and it will take the JSON and put it into a connected dataset like memtable, query, whatever.
The other component that does that is the FD batch move. I mean, it can write from a data set to either a file or a stream. And it can go the other way too. It can read JSON from a file or a stream and put it into a data set, or write it to a SQL Server table. It's a very powerful component and does a bunch of stuff like that.
Exactly. And you can actually watch the adapter if you want to try that one in a tool that comes with Delphi. There is under the main menu, there is options, and there is the REST debugger. The REST debugger is built in Delphi, of course, and it you can construct a REST request in that REST debugger, and once the request returns JSON it will display the raw JSON in a memory-like structure, and there is a button where you can say display the JSON in dataset format, and that uses internally the dataset adapter I was talking about. And once you get that working in the debugger, you can just play around. You can say copy components, and it will create all the required components, including the dataset adapter, and you can paste it to your form or data module and see how you have to set up the components to use it. So it's the REST debugger under tools in the main menu.
Well, it looks like we have time for maybe one more question.
Yes.
And then we're going to have to sign off.
Have you any question in mind? Let me see. What can I find here? Somebody Esmar is saying he just migrated a large system using BDE to FireDAC, and it was quite a struggle with persistent field types, but in the end he really enjoyed the way how his life is a lot easier now after dropping the BDE.
Yeah, right. It's especially if you're working with some of the latest, and I'm talking about in the last 15 years, versions of Delphi. Using the BDE is a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's not pleasant.
Right.
It's been deprecated for a very long time.
But when we had it, it was actually the best that there was.
Well, BDE,
yes, absolutely.
BDE was really a real kind of a breakthrough. It was a very, very useful. It's just that it, back in 1995 when I did the Delphi World Tour, I asked people in the audience, how many of you are using a SQL Server database? And I got about 5% of the people raise their hands. 3 years later, with the Delphi 3 World Tour, it was more like 30%, and it just increased dramatically. So there was a real, and the BDE's solution to talking to Oracle and any Microsoft SQL Server and those types of databases, Sybase was real big at the time, was something called the Borland, oh darn, I can't remember the name, but it was a separate set of DLLs that you had to use, and so the Borland database engine leveraged these SQL drivers, and those got deprecated well before even the BDE was deprecated. Well, in any case, it's I think we need to wrap up here. Jens, Olaf, thank you so much for participating in this discussion. Your input is was extremely good. And thank you all out there who have attended. Great questions, really great questions. We came prepared to talk about things if there were no questions. But we really appreciate your participating with us and asking some challenging questions, and it's really been a pleasure. So for me, thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
Thank you from my side as well, and you're very, very welcome. It's always a pleasure for me. So see you next time.
That sounds fantastic. You all take care, and we'll look forward to the next one.
All right. See you.
All right. Bye.